is it so close?
Yours is better as well.
It's making me uncomfortable.
You can click on the brightness if you don't really see yourself.
Nah, it's on a different tab. It's just like, I don't know, it's just there.
You want me to bring another paper?
Nah, it's okay, it's okay. It's not too big of a deal. I think I'll be okay, guys. It's gonna be tough. Anyways, I'll actually debate now. Yeah. Oh, okay.
We are a bit uncomfortable with the proximity of it.
That's not very funny.
Thank you.
Sorry, my mom's watching. Thanks.
LGBTQ plus media is grossly underrepresented already. Shifting the focus of it away from coming out means it can grow in scale and have great beneficial results for not only LGBTQ people individually, but as a society as we become more progressive. So 3 things in today's speech. Firstly, on some setup. Secondly, why it's harmful to over-glorify the process of coming out. And then finally, how we promote a more holistic identity for the LGBTQ community in media. And then Luca will give a split on how we get more nuanced representation of LGBTQ issues. So firstly, on some setup, what do we define LGBTQ media and pop culture as? So this is just any book, movie, or TV, or like video game exploring themes relating to the LGBTQ plus community. This could be like Heartstopper, which is a Netflix TV show if you haven't seen it, which is focused around like LGBTQ issues and coming out directly, or it could be like a sci-fi show that features some things like and can incorporate this pop culture and like multiple themes or genres, or it could just mean that a large portion of the cast or the characters in the show are like LGBTQ and there is representation here. Note that we don't think this is going to be just like one token member that doesn't come under our definition. So note that these people who are consuming that are generally LGBTQ. What does a focus on coming out content look like? So the main theme, conflict, or focus follows the framework of the coming out story. So we think that generally this looks like you kind of realize who you are yourself, you want to come out, you sort of like explore how you're going to do it, you explore the issues that you might face, the conflict, and then you obviously execute it, whether you get a good or bad reaction from that. Or it's like a show with a few LGBTQ characters that has like a full subplot dedicated to like coming out for that particular character. Why does this focus exist in the status quo? Well, it's just really relatable for all of these people, so it's an easy grounding point for these TV shows or like any media. What's the likely alternative that we support on the affirming side of the house? We support having a variety of themes and stories and experiences. We think that coming out can be included as a theme in this media, but it's never going to be a focal point or a focal theme. Instead, we incorporate other aspects of the LGBTQ community, like experiencing homophobia, or just general portrayals like having a guy on guy, sorry, that was terrible wording, having like a guy date a guy, having a guy date a guy, and it's just like not a big deal, and it's not an issue. So 2 ways we can win today's debate. Firstly, we mitigate the harms to members of the LGBTQ community, or secondly, we generate better societal acceptance for LGBTQ members. So moving on to my point about why it's harmful to over-glorify the process of coming out. So the context here is just that there is a limited LGBTQ representation in media or just in the world in general. So a limited amount of media related to this is produced. Because they are like a minority, right? Like they're a system, because, well, A, they are a minority, and B, there's systematic barriers to entry, like internalized homophobia from like producers and just biases that exist in everyone. We are humans, we have these flaws. Note that a focus on one particular issue in such a small industry means that a huge majority of this genre is focused on that one issue, and it's hard to find other content. So how does this affect consumers of this content? Firstly, they associate their identity with people like them. For example, young black girls watching The Princess and the Frog are going to associate themselves with Princess Tiana and look up to her. This means that on their side, they associate the process of coming out as an inherent part of their identity and an important stepping stone that they have to live up to. On our side, they see other aspects of LGBTQ life to identify with. This means that they pick out things that are relevant to them. This doesn't necessarily have to be coming out, but it could be if it's something they feel that they value or is important to how they express themselves. Secondly, on neg, they internalize this as a natural progression in their lives that they should come out one day. Like, this looks like in the 60s, where TV shows portrayed all women as, like, needing to get married. They conditioned them, these little girls, to the fact that when they grow up, to be successful, they have to find, like, a happy relationship and get married. On our side, some LGBTQ people still come out and love it, but it's not a necessity for everyone. It's not a requirement. This looks like nowadays, where women aren't expected to get married and can just, like, live their lives and focus on their career. So what does this mean? Firstly, on an individual level, on neg, people feel like they have to come out. They feel this pressure. They internalize the fact that everyone has to do it. At our worst, this looks like kids being, like, stressed out that they have to come out, and even if it does go well, they ultimately should have spent that time they spent worrying about this, focusing on bigger things like schools and friends. Not that their personal life isn't important, but there's no point stressing about it if they don't feel like they're ready to do it. This is really distressing for them and bad for them. But a lot of the time, this does look like people who aren't ready and aren't accepted, or aren't accepted, and people might judge them. This looks like friends leaving them because they have, like, subconscious homophobia. They're, like, treated differently at school. They maybe get bullied. They suffer from, like, extreme homophobia, and the school culture that does exist of, like, accepting, like, some subtle homophobia, like, oh, that's gay, or, like, these things that do exist, which is really sad, but they shouldn't have to put up with. In the worst case, this does look like unsafe households where they have, like, extreme religions and actually don't stand for that at all, where they experience, like, abuse and then suffer from trauma for the rest of their life. On our side, when people come out, it's a choice rather than a rite of passage. This means people only do it when they feel 100% ready and confident that that's what they want to do as a person, and they're more cautious about what might come. This is really important because these people are so vulnerable. This is what the debate is about. I think we can win on this point alone, but even then, let's move on to how we promote a more holistic identity for the LGBTQ plus community in the media. Yeah, I'll take a POI really quickly.
Given that when you come out, at the very least, you get to live more years of your life authentically and get to actually, like, know that you are gay, how do you get that? Why is it uniquely harmful?
People still have the option to come out. Like, I think we've been really clear about this. Like, it's not saying we don't have any media showing that people can come out. Like, everyone obviously knows it. It's just not that they see it as, like, an integral part of their identity and who they are as a person. Like, they can still do that. They always have the option. We're just not, like, pressuring people to do it. So how does this media change? Firstly, I've missed a step. So the context here is that media is focused on, like, coming out on their side of the house, which means A, it restricts the genre, and B, there are stigmas, like, when watching it. Like, a straight guy watching Heartstopper might get called, like, gay by their friends. Like, this isn't good. So how does media change now? Firstly, it's less constrained on what you can include in the media, so the focus isn't on, when the focus is on coming out, you can't include, like, a battle scene because that doesn't really relate. The genres, like, contradict each other. On our side, we get a wider variety, which allows more representation. This looks like little girls watching Princess Leia, who is, like, a princess, yes, but she's also a brave warrior and, like, does all these cool, like, action scenes. Secondly, on their side, you perpetuate the idea that being gay isn't normal because these shows need controversy. They need, like, that media incentive of having something juicy for people to buy into. So they always have, like, that one person who's like, oh, you're gay, I don't want to be friends with you anymore. This reinforces the idea that it is not normal to be gay. This is really harmful. What does this mean? Firstly, we normalize LGBTQ identities to people who aren't in that community. They see them more, but not alongside the association that it's something to hate or, like, shun, and this homophobia decreases because people understand it more. Like, seeing a gay guy in an action movie might appeal more to someone who's, like, just into action movies, like a straight person that way. Secondly, it appeals to a broader viewer base. This means that we get rid of that stigma to watch it because it is such a broad genre. We capitalize on LGBTQ representation, meaning that we get more diverse genres in the future. Like, when we get more viewers and more buy-in into that genre, it's more likely that they're going to produce more in the future. This means that we just get more diversity and we get more representation as a whole in media, which is really important to make these people feel included and make people aware and less likely to, like, commit hate speech. Very proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I'd like to invite up the first speaker for the meeting.
Coming out is one of the hardest things a queer individual has to do. We're proud to support a world where those individuals are now supported by media narratives. That's the side we support on our side. Three things in the speech. Firstly, some notes on characterization, followed by two constructives. Firstly, on catharsis, secondly, on awareness. Two win conditions in the speech. Right? Firstly, we either get more catharsis for queer individuals, that's one way we can win, or we prove that we uniquely propel the LGBTQ movement forward throughout history, given its regrets motion. Rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, then, on characterization. The first thing we heard from side affirmatives is that we're going to have queer celebration, we're going to celebrate all parts of being queer and have all kinds of media, right? The problem with this is that firstly, businesses are majority heterosexual, right? And they're majority heteronormative. That means that they won't necessarily campaign for this mass amount of queer celebration that they try to say, right? Why is this the case? Because in the vast majority of cases, LGBTQ representation is tokenized, but more importantly, there are structural reasons that we can't get this level of perfect representation, right? Stuff like money, stuff like capital, stuff like resource allocation. They conceded in their introduction that it was apparently LGBTQ representation was already unpopular. It then therefore was a logical leap for them to say that we're going to focus on everything. We don't think they have the fiat to just assert that they're going to have perfect media under their side. The bottom line is we think historically then what this means that you're going to have worse queer representation. Know quickly that we want to broaden the scope of this debate, right? It's a regrets motion. We're going to deal with everything that's not current. We're going to deal with the 1950s, right? During those eras, before homophobia was back when homophobia was incredibly rampant, we think that the Overton window with coming out as a narrative was what changed social narratives. Why then is coming out so uniquely beneficial? They actually conveniently characterize this for us, right? Firstly, on universality. That's to say that everyone knows what it's like to keep a secret. We think that that's why people get a lot of buy-in. That means that at their best, even if they get the best narratives, they're unlikely to get the amount of buy-in because the coming out narrative panders to heteronormative people because it's universal. We know what that means is that it is the most likely thing to be popular, the most likely thing to actually get reach. Furthermore, then, let's characterize what it feels like to be a queer person. It looks like a number of things. Firstly, on internalized homophobia. That's to say that internalized homophobia is universal for the vast majority of queer people. That's because you have conflicting heteronormative narratives in the status quo, stuff like being raised in a heterosexual family, stuff like being pounded by straight narratives. I think that means that in the vast majority of cases, the majority of queer people have experienced internalized homophobia. Secondly, on religious stigma. That looks like the Destiny Church in New Zealand. That looks like the evangelical Christian narratives you have in Middle America. We think that those fundamental frameworks dictate how you are socialized in society. It is incredibly tough for you to break out of that. Thirdly, then, on high social cost to being queer, we think that looks like microaggressions. That looks like disappointing your Asian family. That is the social cost of being gay in the status quo. Fourthly, on communities. There are high barrier of entries to reaching gay communities, especially in places like Texas, when homophobia locks out stuff like pride youth groups. We think that the bottom line is coming out is incredibly hard and the lives of these queer people are incredibly difficult. We think that what we are providing when we have this narrative is coming out is the affirmation of identity. We are giving them a support system. First point then on catharsis. And note here that this clashes with a lot of ass material. Recognize that coming out takes place in an emotionally sensitive time in a person's life when they feel isolated, when they have no viable community to turn to. We think then that it's also hard to come out, whereas you have processes of self-denial when you're telling yourself that the person in the mirror cannot be who you truly are. I think that that's highly detrimental because that is literally your identity. Note here that it is easier for people to grasp pop culture because it's a gateway. It's the most easiest mechanism to propagate positive narratives. That looks like being able to see gay characters on screen, actually know, oh, what I am feeling is actually normal, it's actually okay. I think that's a benefit. What change do we get on our side? Three things. Firstly, on accessibility. That means that it's extremely easy to opt into this narrative, right? That looks like you turning on the TV, seeing gay characters, you going outside, or going to your favorite TV show, your favorite cinema, seeing gay characters coming out. That's incredibly supportive because you're actually able to relate to those characters. Secondly, on normalization. When you have more frequent narratives in the status quo, when pop culture everywhere brandishes this idea of coming out in music videos and whatnot, we think that means that you get the Overton window, right? That means you shift public perception that is more positive. This is incredibly important, historically, when homophobia has been rampant, we think that this has been a vehicle to change social perspectives. Fourthly thing, we think that it's just uniquely comforting, right? When you see a character going through the same struggles that you have gone through, we think that gives you a lot of catharsis, a lot of comfort as a person who is queer. We think that at App's very best, you're going to get some period where you don't know if you're going to come out. We think that because you have no propelling motivation, we think that in those cases, you are firstly denying people their identity, the inability to look themselves in the mirror and actually love who they are. We think that looks like gender dysmorphia. We think that at the very least, that debilitating circumstance during that time is enough to win us this debate. But furthermore, then we think just not providing this support system in the extreme cases, making them feel isolated, is what leads to stuff like suicide. We think that the impacts of this point are twofold. Firstly, on support, we give them a vehicle for motivation that looks like a kid in the closet being able to benefit from these narratives, actually being able to find comfort. But secondly, on catharsis, that we're giving them that we're reaffirming their identities. We think even if you don't come out on our side, the large benefits of just normalizing the LGBTQ narrative resists centuries of heteronormativity. I think that is a clash that they had to like overcome. I mean, furthermore, then everyone comes out eventually, right? Because it is a key function to our identity. We think that on our side, when you do come out, you have a support system that actually is able to engage and protect you from homophobia. We think that on our side, we win on protecting vulnerable actors. Before I move on to your point.
By not limiting LGBTQ representation in the media to the theme of coming out, you're able to like...
Okay, I told you firstly why coming out was uniquely the most, like the best vehicle for social change. I'll now deal with what that means in a historical context that affirmative just never like wanted to engage with, all right? Firstly, on context. Note that historically, homophobia has been incredibly rampant. That is to say that like it was incredibly hard historically to come out as gay. But coming out in pop culture was a unique vehicle that propelled LGBTQ plus movements forward. Why is this the case? Firstly, on popularity, when you have normalized narratives, when you see characters in pop TV, in popular TV shows coming out, that is a gateway for a lot of people into LGBTQ struggles. That looks like in the 1970s when a kid is watching TV and for the first time in their lives they see a person coming out. That is the first time in which they have that they engage with this issue. I think that for all the reasons before, that is a great way to propagate positive narratives. Secondly, then on representation. That means that the awareness of the struggles of coming out, the difficulties of coming out, brings attention to what it's like to be queer, the struggles of facing a homophobic society. I think in the instances where homophobia is we think this is the first instance in which homophobia was actually condemned and portrayed in a negative light, rather than just being the regular behavior of society. Thirdly, then, on buy-in, we think that as long as all demographics are seeing this, from your young boy to your old man, we think that means that you are encouraging a new generation, a new society that sees LGBTQ plus narratives as normal. We see this in history. We are now far more accepting of gay and queer people as compared to the 1950s when that was how that pop culture narrative was how we got here. What are the impacts of this point? We think it's twofold. Firstly, historically, we think we're shifting narratives. That is to say that we're at, historically, what this narrative has functioned and what it has done for us is that it has enfranchised LGBTQ plus people. It has given them awareness, it has given them political capital. It has told society that LGBTQ plus people do deserve rights, they are just another human being. Note, we win this debate, insofar as we are able to prove that the popularization of coming out was the main vehicle that allowed LGBTQ plus people to stand as people. We think on societal awareness, the ability to educate people, the ability to tell the queer person that they are loved, that they are okay, that they are a person, we think insofar as we're breaking centuries of homophobia and homophobic beliefs, that we win this debate. We're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. I'd like to invite up the second speaker to the event.
The fact that negating is able to stand up here and tell us that everyone comes out eventually just fundamentally proves that the internalized narratives that we brought you at first exist. It proves that this idea that every queer person should come out, has pressure to come out and will eventually come out in their lives is a factor that is at play. We told you why that was so harmful, and we told you why that just simply wasn't necessary for the identity of these individuals. We think that the best way to affirm these people is to keep them physically safe, to reduce the amount of harms that come to them from coming out when they're not ready. And we think that when we actually get better normalization, we're able to present these communities in a variety of genres. Okay, I have three things I want to touch on in the speech. Firstly, just a small clarification on framework, on framing. Then a point of clash on normalization, a point of clash on coming out, and then a split point on how we get more nuanced representation of LGBTQ issues in media. So firstly, just on this framing about like, what are the actual two worlds? Note that like, it was a bit unclear on like what they saw the counterfactual as in their world, because they told us that like when you don't have this coming out as the focus of LGBTQ media, you just like simply don't get any LGBTQ plus media. Like I think this fundamentally like doesn't engage with the material we gave you about like why this focus exists in the first place, right? The reason why we have a focus on coming out is because like there needs to be something like obviously you don't want to just have LGBTQ plus people in media and like it doesn't explore any themes or anything that those people go through, right? So we tell you that the reason why there is this focus is because it like grounds them. It's like something that is relatable to all those people. We tell you that that is not the only thing that can be relatable as a member of that community. We tell you that's not the only thing that defines you as a person of that community. And like, so when there is still a market for it, like on both sides of the house, because obviously you're not going to erase LGBTQ plus people on either side of the house, they still exist. There are still people who want to watch content that reflects the kinds of things they go through in their lives. They still want relatable narratives so that they can engage with those characters and so that they can feel that like identification, right? What that means then is that there is still an incentive for like some industries to put out LGBTQ plus narratives, and like we tell you that when the focus is not on coming out, that naturally the focus will turn to other things, that you will get a more nuanced interpretation, that you will see more issues being explored. The other thing I just want to deal with is like this idea that like the debate somehow takes place in the 1960s. I think that that's like fundamentally wrong, because we didn't have LGBTQ plus media in the 1960s. Like this was something that was only popularized when like we got broad acceptance of LGBTQ plus people, when like gay marriage was even legalized in most countries. This is media that's only started coming out in the last decade, so there's no way that they can bring any kind of historical like aspect to this debate. Now I just want to talk on like normalization, right? They said that like you normalize coming out when you make it the focus of your stories, right? I want to point out that there is like a difference, because a lot of the impacts that they gave you were largely symmetric, because there is a difference between normalizing people of the LGBTQ plus community and normalizing the process of coming out, right? What they do on their side with like getting more representation, with getting more people like seeing LGBTQ plus stories, seeing each LGBTQ plus characters, and then just internalizing that as like a normal part of life is symmetric, because we still get those stories on our side. What do they then get on their side is that they normalize this idea that every single individual in these communities comes out at one point or another in their life, and that it should be like a major part of their life, right? That it's like this big tipping point, this big pressure point, because obviously we tell you that like these media companies have an incentive to make these stories like compelling. And what makes stories compelling is when there's like some juice to it. There's some like, if these people were to come out and it was just completely unproblematic and everyone was like, yay, we accept you, all happy and good, like obviously that's not a very interesting narrative. There's not a lot of conflict in there that drives the story forward. So what they're incentivized to do is to, every single time there is like a coming out narrative, there's always some form of like resentment that comes alongside it. There's always the like homophobic uncle who like doesn't support you. There's always the like friends who then bully you. What this means is that what you associate, like, because we tell you that there's like a low amount of this like media coming out anyway, is that like for every like LGBTQ plus child who watches these shows, every time they see the process of coming out, they associate that process of coming out with the rejection. They associate it with the like disgust that comes from people like who don't support these communities, right? That is the really harmful thing. And what we get uniquely on our side is just a normalization of LGBTQ plus people without this being like intrinsically attached to this idea of coming out. Because like, again, we tell you about this like variety in genre, which largely went unresponded to. Why are you unlikely to get a variety of genre when the focus is on coming out? Because firstly, the themes just clash, right? Like, when you're wanting to make like a story about horror, or like, you know, big powers clashing, or personal identity just doesn't come into that, which means that it's like counterintuitive to the purpose of the story. The writers don't want that. But secondly, we tell you that there are different audiences for different genres. So the kinds of people that will buy into a sci-fi show are likely like the kinds of people who like you might get more of like a straight male audience, which means those are the kinds of people who would push back potentially, like if there's more homophobia in that audience, against coming out being a part of those stories. Which means that when your focus is on coming out, you restrict LGBTQ plus media to be strictly strictly like this high schooler like experience, something like Heartstopper. On our side, we uniquely get the benefits of being able to branch out to like multiple different genres. What this means is that you make LGBTQ+ not like core to someone's identity, you make it a part of them, but you don't make it the only thing that characterizes them as an individual. This is where we get the best normalization on our side. This is where we get buy-in from people not in the communities who actually now will watch this content because there is like something in it for them, like it has the sci-fi as well as the LGBTQ+. That's how you get more money in the industry. That's how you get more representation down the line, more like identification. That's how you also like normalize it to people, which gets you less homophobia, all of that bad things that they talked about, all of those microaggressions, we get less of that on our side. Now just on like the process of coming out. They tell us that everyone comes out eventually, right? Ultimately, like this is just simply not true. Like as an LGBTQ+ person, like there is not a need for you to publicly announce like who you're like attracted to. Like that's just personal information, right? Like it's not something like people aren't pressured to like tell everyone, oh, what's my type, just because you're a straight guy. Like I'm gonna tell the whole world like I like this particular type of woman. Like that's not like the case, right? It's the same thing for LGBTQ+ people. There is no inherent need for them to come out at any point in their lives. They can choose to with the people that they are close to, but there is no need for them to make that public. What this then means is that like all of the like harms that we told you at first, which went unresponded to, about how like you make it a core part of their identity, how you put more pressure on these kids to like come out when they're not ready to and when they're in unsafe situations. This means that you put them in a position where they're more prone to all of these harms. You put them in a position where they're more prone to bullying at school, and in the worst cases, you put them in a position where they could suffer abuse because they see from this TV show, oh, coming out is like the right thing to do. I want to come out because that's what everything in my culture is telling me I should do. And then they do that, and then they're shunned by their family. They don't have any support networks. That's where you get the worst harms for these individuals. Now, my substantive contribution, how we get more nuanced representation. We tell you that there are many other issues that LGBTQ+ people face beyond coming out. There's like being treated differently. It's internalized homophobia. It's like the process of gender transitioning. It's like this idea that gender norms don't work the same way in gay relationships as they do in straight relationships. When you have a focus on coming out, you undermine those issues because you simply have less time to portray those themes, and they're seen as secondary to this idea of coming out. What this means now is we get media that is more nuanced, is like actually understands the complexity of these LGBTQ+ issues. It means you actually get better understanding of people and like better sympathy, and also people within that community are able to watch these shows and like learn from how to deal with these problems.
I'd like to thank the speaker for this speech. I'd like to invite up the second speaker of the debate.
The problem with AF today is they have not been able to tell us why their counterfactual A is remotely likely to happen, or B actually uniquely better or best at representing and giving catharsis to queer people than coming out, which bear in mind everyone does have to do eventually. Two things to do in the speech. First on the clashes, second a split about how we uniquely improve buy-in to the queer movement. Okay, first clash today on accuracy and portrayal. I think this was the main push that we got from affirmative today. I want to flag for a moment that some of the narratives that they wanted to claim on their side of the house were not exclusive to them. Examples, stuff like Princess Leia from first affirmative, stuff like mixing genres and having like gay themes in Star Trek or something from second affirmative. We don't think that these things are even like remotely exclusive to their side. What their burden is then is to prove that we should regret this narrative for all of its existence, and guess what? Its existence starts in the 60s. I'm going to prove that a bit later. We also tell you that their idea of like there being a variety of narratives is not enough. We tell you that coming out is simply the best way to show these things. But I think the fact that they explicitly mention that we still have this narrative is like some implicit agreement that we need to have this to some extent. Okay. A few responses here. First, we told you that the Overton window needed to shift to get to 2024 in the first place. We tell you, and I will prove in greater depth later, that coming out narrative is very effective, and it shows, for example, the heartlessness with which the queer community is treated on a daily basis. To be realistic, you can't have a heteronormative narrative. The debate, sadly, is not happening in 2024, but in 1950, when this kind of thing was entering the public consciousness with like the Vietnam War, with like the lavender scare. Note then that all of their benefits are contingent on this debate like happening in 2020. This simply isn't true. We never get their positives in the first place. We had to have stuff like the counterculture against Vietnam. We had to have stuff like closeted poets first writing about their experiences, about their ability to, guess what, their lack of ability to come out in the first place. Secondly, we also tell you that this narrative is very relatable. Why is this? Because to sell, you need to be interesting. You need to sell a story first and foremost. Why is this true? Because we touch on universal themes that even straight people can relate with, such as hiding a secret, such as the fear of social rejection. What this means is we can resonate, that this narrative can resonate with everyone. Thirdly, we tell you that this is a better story and like it's more engaging, there's higher stakes, and then it's just a natural progression of like hiding a secret. Note that we need to sell this narrative to hetero people. It's just so much more engaging, which is why that the counterfactual on the F side is just not credible, because what they're telling us is not a story, it's propaganda. We can flip this then, because we decrease buy-in for both people who aren't queer and also people who are queer, because they see that these people, that they themselves are not being depicted accurately. Fourthly then, we tell you realism. Realism sells. Like there's a monetary interest in keeping things realistic. Building on that, it's also like showing the absolute cruelty with which these people are treated every day. Responding directly to Luca for a moment, there is always a homophobic uncle in these stories to signify the fact that society sucks. Society will tread over you because you are gay. That is something that we need to have in the media because we don't want to have this sort of false information. I will touch on that as well. Fifthly, we tell you that queer actors and like producers are always going to stand for this. What does this mean at the end of the day? It means we shouldn't believe the counterfactual that F has given us, plain and simple. We should believe that a focus on coming out as a storyline is also engaging and realistic. Even if then we believe their counterfactual, that is somehow completely and uniquely affirming in a way that is exclusive to their side of the house, and like that isn't realistic. I'll show that later. And if you further then, if you buy a single one of our mix, you should also believe that this counterfactual isn't realistic because the media will simply select for the coming out narrative. Their benefits don't stand. Then on coercion, I think this was their other push in essence. They tell us that this narrative makes you think that you need to come out and that we're coercing these vulnerable people out to do this. Note for a moment, coming out is not me coming into this room and telling you that I am queer. It's just not shouting to everyone over the mountains that I am queer, but it can be private. It can be telling your parents, for heaven's sake, that you are indeed queer. I think the characterization they have given us is an absolute straw man. Okay, a few responses. First, on symmetry, we tell you that like the tipping point for coming out is not watching a movie or 2 movies or 3 TV series. We tell you the average person still does understand the risk calculus of coming out to some extent. We tell you that the people who are actually empowered to act by this are the people who are already convinced that they are queer, or the people who are already safe. What this means is safety is symmetric at best on both sides of the house. Secondly then, we tell you we uniquely can balance the narrative. Because the status quo is already coercive against people trying to come out, that's like outright homophobia and the religious stuff that Matthew told you about, but also the internalized homophobia and, oh, that's gay, that also coerces you against coming out. We can balance the coercive power. Their point does not stand. Thirdly then, on a flip level, on emotional support, we tell you that you need to come out eventually, because, and I'll show this later. Why is it then that our media can actually support you, and why is this especially good? Because you're directly mirroring this experience. You're actively mirroring this experience. What this means then is like it's less debilitating when you are rejected or if there is a hate crime committed against you. Fourthly, and most importantly then, I think we need to establish that coming out is almost always better, and this is especially true for the moderate Western countries that we are talking about in this debate. What does being queer actually mean? It means dating people you don't actually like because you have to. It means suffering gender dysphoria every time you go in front of a mirror and asking, am I real? It's just fitting a shoe that fundamentally does not fit. The comparative is that neg is compelling them to years of their life being someone that they actually are not. That is why we have such bad mental health outcomes for these people. That is why rates of suicide and self-harm are so high. It's their narrative. Even if then we believe that we are making some queer people act against their own best interests, we tell you that this is not likely to be a large change, and we tell you that like the film is not a tipping point, and we should not want to support hundreds of thousands of people necessarily needing to stay in the closet. I'll take a point.
Do you think that restricting media to just the idea of coming out does not have an internal effect on the person where they internalize that they need that to be a big part of how they live their life and how they succeed in their identity? Do you not think that this is widely unhealthy for them?
Oh, I think it's true, because if you're queer, you essentially need to live a normal life. You need to tell the world that I am queer. I don't think that this is remotely harmful in any way at all. Okay, then on the split on buy into the movement, one big make, we tell you that over time, narratives change as the Overton window mechanism that we gave to you before, uniquely because the narrative of coming out is so great. What this means then is the average person is more receptive, and over the long term we get more buy-in to our side of the house. This is exclusive because coming out is palatable to the average het cis person. Secondly, we also tell you that norms have changed, and it's the expectation that we aren't actually homophobic, like the norm is in 2024. 3 impacts then. First, we tell you that the queer movement just gets more legitimacy on our side of the house. Secondly, they get more buy-in. Thirdly, they get more voting power and capital. What this means is in places like the US and the UK, they're less likely to let efforts happen where they're taking the drugs away to keep them alive or taking away gender affirming care. Note then that the affirmative counterfactual has to be just as good, if not more effective, than this narrative. If you believe any of the mix that we gave you, this simply won't be true. Proud to stand for a stronger queer community.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I'd like to invite up the third speaker of the forum.
The negating side of the house has blatantly mischaracterized a lot of the LGBT experience and even the impacts it will have on them as a child if they get misguided into coming out early. They've ignored our points on this, as well as just frankly losing on these points about how the public will buy in and then the positive impacts from that, as well as just the other effects it has on gender identity as a whole. And that is why we win this debate. A few things in this debate. First, I'm going to go over a clarification just to do with the timing and framing of this debate and how even the point about them placing it in the 1960s. Then I'm going to go over 2 primary points of clash, and that is the effect that this has on LGBT people individually and their identity, as well as just the public buy-in and more acceptance that you get from LGBT media being depicted in this way. I'm then also going to briefly just kind of summarize the debate and why we won. So the first thing I want to talk about is the point from us that this takes place in the 1950s or 60s primarily. So there are a couple of things to note with this. The first is that, as we did clarify, and they failed to actually engage with at all, LGBT pop culture and media simply wasn't such a massive or prevalent thing as it is today, right? Because it was so frowned upon, there simply wasn't a platform for this to be its own branch of media that affected a lot of people. So I think this is less relevant, but also even if you believe that there was some sort of LGBT media scene back then, the bottom line is, because it's so much more prevalent now and reaches a lot more youth, it is actually more important to measure it in today's society and recent history as well. And regardless, a lot of our other points about public buy-in and the identity still stand back then either way. But also, so just to clarify, I don't think the 1950s things matters or is particularly accurate. Now to move on to the effect that it has on LGBTQ people, okay? So one thing that I want to talk about is the fact that, like, we talked about how if you portray this as a key part of the LGBT experience, and it's in, like, effectively all of the media or core focus of it, this creates an identity for these LGBT people to, like, try and fulfill and think that that's a cool part of their deal. Note that this went effectively, like, unresponded to by the negating side. They didn't actually, like, show any reason why it isn't problematic that this becomes a large part of their identity, whereas we gave you multiple mechanisms on why this can actually be, like, so disastrous on a personal level to these younger people, okay? We told you how, like, the fact that they see it as being a core part of the LGBT experience can get like, more vulnerable kids who aren't in a situation where they should come out to actually do it, and the negative effects it has on them. Okay, this looks like abuse and trauma and, like, bullying from other people their age because they came out early because their identity was shaped from them by media portraying coming out as, like, an integral part of this experience. They haven't given us any reasons why these negatives don't happen, and we think this should be weighed incredibly highly because this is, like, their experience with their sexuality when they're younger, and the media focusing on coming out directly led to them having all these negative outcomes, and I think this is incredibly problematic and just simply did not get engaged enough from the negating team. They also told us that, like, as you have, like, you know, more, I guess, we don't have the same accuracy of like, portrayals. One thing that I think is important to know is that if you really think that we don't get it, I don't really think that this is something you can claim as being more accurate on your side. What I mean by that is if we're portraying other parts of the LGBTQ experience and you don't think it's accurate, they haven't given us any mechanisms on why their side would actually be any more accurate to the LGBTQ experience. But as I'll prove to you, like, we actually have mechanical reasons why like, it's actually just more beneficial to focus on other parts of the LGBTQ experience. So even though they tried to tell us that, like, you know, the catharsis of just seeing this in the media when LGBT people experience this or watch people coming out, I don't think that you can actually use this to outweigh the direct negative effects it has on kids or, like, younger people coming out when they aren't ready for it, as well as just the fact that they feel their identity's made for them. I simply don't think that that is, like, sufficient there, okay? The next point of clash that I'm going to go over is the public buy-in, and I think this was obviously an important factor in the debate, right? I think we can both agree that having, like, less discrimination in public and social situations is beneficial for these people, but we actually, like, have comprehensively proven why we get less like, homophobia and better outcomes for these people, right? They told us that like, people relate to secrets, like, that is why this is really beneficial. Why is this simply not true? Well, let's actually look at, like, what the alternatives are, right? Like, the alternative things people can relate to. We were told that everyone knows what it's like to keep a secret, therefore, like, coming out is something they can relate to. First, I think it's, like, really silly to act like it's actually a comparison and something people can directly relate to between having to keep a secret at one point of your life as, like, a straight person. It could be something quite minor, whereas, like, actually having a massive part of your identity that you have to state, and it's going to affect how people treat you for the rest of your life. So I think the idea that that's something that people just naturally simply isn't true, and other components of the LGBTQ experience, like, simply do have more direct relations, which will mean more buy-in. And what I mean by this is, like, just being discrimination, even if it's not about sex, your, like, gender or sexuality. Like, a lot of people have still been discriminated based on something the country called at some point in their life, whether it be skin color or, like, socioeconomic background. People can relate to discrimination. So it being portrayed on the screen is actually much more relatable to them on a personal level because they're more likely to have gone through it. There are also just, like, the idea of not being able to be with, like, someone you want. That's also something that a lot of people can relate to. And so that's another alternative part of the LGBT experience that people can relate to a lot more. And so what both of those mean is that, as we've said, there are other parts of this LGBT experience that we should put and focus on media that in any, like, period of time, like, in history, would get more buy-in. So what does more buy-in lead to since we have more of it on this side of the house? It leads to, like, just overall better social situations for one, for these people. There's less discrimination. They feel more comfortable expressing themselves because people are more exposed to these things. And also, like, secondly, it just shows that like, even within, like, voting and laws like that, if this does take place in the 50s, you get more buy-in earlier, which allows changes to be made to make these people more comfortable. The other points about public buy-in simply don't really apply. They try to tell us that, it makes a better story, which, like, really is, one, just subjective, and two, dependent on writing. I don't really think that's very feasible, and I've already told you why people relate more to other stories. And also, they've told us that realism sells, but again, that's also symmetrical with issues we're saying. You can realistically depict things like, you know, not being able to be with who you want or discrimination, right? But I'm also now. I'll actually take a point of flash before I move on.
Given that for pop culture to functionally exist, large-scale heteronormative individuals need to opt into the media that you have on your side. If you get a better framework, why do the majority of people ever opt into your media?
So I actually have basically already directly addressed this. I gave you multiple examples of why the issues that we're covering are actually more relatable for people to opt into this, so I don't really think that's too relevant to the debate. Now I'm just going to move on to like the fact of that we had a split point from our speaker, that our second speaker, that addressed like why this actually directly undermines other issues, right? It's also important to represent things like, you know, not understanding gender norms or the gender transitioning, internalized homophobia, and just discrimination in general. We gave you material from our second speaker on why these things get undermined if you focus too much on other issues. We didn't hear any response from him on why these still get why they still get coverage or gets represented, and so this is incredibly important. So why do we win this debate? Okay, the bottom line is we have comprehensively proven to you why we get more buy-in for one, right? That leads, obviously, as I've said, to like better situation for these people and more voting in their favor. We've also shown you an entire point that went unresponded to about how people who aren't ready to come out will come out, and this like directly affects their whole childhood and interaction with their sexuality because of how negative this bullying at school was over their sexuality, or maybe like even to their parents, how they were abused, right? This is much more important than any like marginal extra buy-in, if you take them at their best, that you get from the public, or just like better, more control over their like media, or being able to make their own movies, right? Because like that was some of their later material. The bottom line is this is super important because kids are being like abused and hurt, and their sexuality with their relationship with their sexuality from their childhood is tarnished, as well as just the fact that we also have more buy-in overall. Proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I'd now like to invite the third speaker from the debate.
As a queer individual, the hardest thing that I have to do in my life is deal with the fact that I am actually queer, is to acknowledge that fact. And it's so much harder for me to acknowledge that when the media that surrounds me is all about how people in the LGBTQ community who already know that they are gay, who already know that they are queer, exist. What I need to know, what is the most important narrative for me in my life, is to see other individuals overcome that barrier, is to see someone who exists in a heteronormative community accept their own individual life, accept the fact that they are gay, and that I too can do that. It doesn't necessarily mean that at a young age I'm coerced into coming out to the public. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because that media narrative exists, that I have to do that. A few things to do in my speech, 3 things. Firstly, at the top of my speech, we'll just talk about what that media narrative looks like, the scope of it. Secondly, what both teams care about the most, what happens to queer individuals, and then thirdly, on broader societal change. Firstly then, on the top of my speech, we'll just talk about the scope of this. NEG never really deals with the fact that to functionally have pop culture media, you need to have large-scale buy-in. I don't think it's clear that at third F, they can come up and say, all individuals have felt discrimination, therefore they can opt into LGBTQ media when that isn't necessarily mutually exclusive. Because down the line we've told you that functionally for queer media surrounding narratives about coming out to exist, you have to talk about the problems that individual faces. So then we do get the issues of discrimination that these individuals face. We do get to see how hard it is for these individuals to come out to a world that does not accept them. At the end of this, you need to believe that the opt-in isn't mutually exclusive to their side. What then is the main thing that is really important about media that surrounds coming out? Coming out is something that the average individual who isn't queer can necessarily deal with because it still exists within that heteronormative framework. The more exclusively queer a piece of media is, the more removed it is from things like the gender binary that your average individual believes has been raised in, but also secondly, the heteronormative qualities that the average individual has lived in. So I think generally, when a piece of media actually still exists within that heteronormative sphere, your average person is more likely to opt into it. You are, at least to some extent, even in our worst case, able to get more buy-in. That has the following effects to generally just firstly reaching more people. Secondly, reaching people in communities who like probably wouldn't have had access to this media in the first place. This was the main thing that side affirming had never contested in this debate. This is a key piece of framing that could win us this debate. Okay, now then on what both teams care about the most, which is queer individuals. Bob wants to win on harms that are contingent to this narrative. That firstly, that this narrative is actively coercive, or that secondly, that this narrative actually means that that is actively terrible for queer individuals. Firstly then, let's talk about coercion. Down the line, we've told you that queer individuals constantly make that risk calculus in their life. Matthew told you a billion things about what it feels like to be a queer individual, right? It's all of the internalized homophobia and all of the external factors that you have to contend with. So what that means is that I'm not going to watch Heartstopper and then suddenly come out to my evangelical Christian family and then deal with all of the harms that side affirming tries to tell me that's going to happen to me. I'm not going to be forced at a young age to come out because I'm in the worst cases, in those instances where it would be so terrible for me to come out, I wouldn't have made that choice in the first place. What this debate really is about is the people who are on the margins, the people who are on that tipping point. It's about individuals who needed to deal with the fact that firstly they existed, that when they looked in the mirror, that gender dysphoria is real, and that it is something that other individuals do deal with, and that it was a confounding factor in their coming out. And secondly, that coming out generally does mean that you get to live life authentically, that you get to accept that you as a person are actually queer, that you don't sit at night and think, wow, was it more important for me to have come out 5 years ago and actually get to live those 5 years as myself, or was it more important for me to stay in the closet to try to protect myself from all of those all of the backlash that I would have gotten? Note that Alan also told you that that majority of queer people do come out eventually because they want to live that life. The comparative is when you come out, do you feel firstly more supported? But secondly, when you do face adversity, is it something that you have reflected within a piece of media that you generally care about, or is it something that you generally just feel far worse about? What you need to believe at the end of this is that the worst harms that Bob tries to push cannot functionally happen. Then then Bob tries to win off the fact that this is just terrible for the average person. I've already told you that when I see a piece of queer media, I'm far less likely to take away the worst aspects of it, because as a person I make those distinctions, right? I get to choose what I take away from that piece of media. It doesn't necessarily mean if that media glorifies a certain aspect and is actively terrible, that is something that I necessarily want to be taking away from it, because I look to things that individually matter to me. I look to narratives that I actively do care about. I think, and then under this point, coming out doesn't necessarily always mean that you're telling every single person out there that you're gay. It doesn't necessarily mean that you stand up on the bleachers at school and you say, guys, I'm queer, please accept me. Oftentimes it's the things that I've noted before under this point. It's generally accepting yourself as a person. It's seeing the adversity that other people faced, and in those instances where you were on the margins, you made that choice to come out, and that was something that is far more likely to be good for you. Okay. I'll take that, actually.
A straight person never has to come out or share their personal identity. Why is it therefore fair to pressure a queer person to come out even if they don't choose to express themselves in that way?
Two things. Firstly, I told you that coercion doesn't happen. Secondly, the fact is, straight people are more likely to buy into it because it actively pertains to the heteronormative framework. Okay, now let's talk about the broader changes to society. The only pushback from side affirming is that the counterfactual doesn't exist in 1960. It actually does exist in let's say 2016, when gay marriage was legalized in all states in the United States. Let's take this time frame and let's take them at their best. I think even if after gay marriage still existed, and that means that there were more queer individuals to opt into their media on their side of the house, if we believe that is actually the counterfactual. I think firstly the number of people is actively less because there is in that heteronormative framework, but also secondly that it's not pertinent to to your average person, right? Because of all of the things that I told you before about about how discrimination and all of the things that your average individual could have opted into wasn't mutually exclusive to their framework and actively was far less likely to happen under their framework due to the fact that it was likely going to be particularly queer and particularly about those kinds of things. So at the end of this point, you need to believe that like it's far more relatable, at least to some extent on our side of the house, when you have the capacity for for straight individuals to opt into it. And this means that generally, like, this is really important because straight individuals were the ones who are more likely to do things like shift the Overton window. They were the ones who necessarily were the ones that a queer person like myself had to deal with when they told me that when they told me that my identity wasn't real, when they told me that I was lying. So I think that generally when you get more straight people to buy into this, to buy into the movement, that is when, at the very base level, it's far easier to be a queer person because you're far less likely to be homophobic insofar as you're consuming media that actively talks about this. But also on a broader, bigger scale, you get far more things like actual action for the queer community. You get gender-affirming care earlier insofar as you are more likely to get political power. So proud to stand with queer people.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech. As is tradition, we'll flip speaking orders. I'd like to invite up Cooney for leadership.
This debate wasn't necessarily about seeing gay people on screen. It was about, for the teenager in the closet, to see someone on screen that shows the same struggles as them, to tell them that they are real and that they deserve to be loved. We think that that was where we won this debate. A couple things in the speech. Firstly, I'm going to outline why our coming out as a narrative prevails on top, followed by two other points. Firstly, on the queer individual, and secondly, on societal change. But firstly, on coming out as a narrative. What side affirmative told us down the line was that they told us other things were better, and that coming out wasn't necessarily the most satisfactory narrative to push. What did we tell you? We told you that the context under which this debate lied was for vulnerable actors. That is the queer people in the closet. We think that the process of coming out is more relatable to them and more pertinent to them than any other stuff like homosexual conversion, like homosexual discrimination. We think that coming out exclusively was beneficial to them. But secondly then, we also told you on universality and buying for the general public, we told you that coming out exclusively was something that heteronormative frameworks would buy into because straight people would see this firstly view this as more palatable because there's this element of relatability and universality. But furthermore, then, unlike other more extreme narratives, we think that universality and coming out exclusively was something that these frameworks would accept. We told you that just having secrets is something that everyone could relate to. Then what does that mean? It means that on a fundamental level, we think that their comparatives weren't sufficient. They didn't deal with the vulnerable actors, but furthermore, then we didn't think it was likely that they could just say that, oh, we're going to champion everything all the time. Secondly, then, on queer individuals. The first thing they told us is that we're going to coerce people into coming out early and prematurely, and that's going to be really, really harmful. We told you firstly that it wasn't a tipping point in this debate. There are other risk calculations that people make before they come out. We told you that those still exist under our side. The difference is, in that really, really fragile process of coming out, we're giving them support, and in the vast majority of cases, we're giving them the comfort and the confidence to maybe approach it in a different way that's more beneficial to them. Secondly, then, on actors, we told you down the line that the most vulnerable actors in the debate were the people in the closet. We told you that no narrative was better because you were actively and empirically representing their struggles on screen. Secondly, then, on support. We told you, and we just think that this was something that the benefits of that they never responded to, or they couldn't claim, because we told people that it was right to embrace their identity. I think the point at which they lost the debate was that when they told people they should never come out, that you should never fully accept your identity. We think that they do, that accepting your identity is a major benefit on our side, and when you do come out, we prepare them better on our side. Look, in any other world, it wasn't good enough for us to just see gay characters going through gay issues on screen. We think that the period of coming out was a pivotal period in this debate. It was a barrier and it was an argument on the margins. We think then relatability was a metric that you ought to weigh really, really highly because it was the benefit to these fragile individuals. That was how we should win this point. Then we win books, we benefit the queer teenagers in the closet. Second point then, on social change. And just on this whole 1950s clash, right? The point was, no matter what time period you want to argue this in, Coming out was a unique vehicle of change because we told you stuff like palatability and universality. We gave you analysis on the Overton window and why it was more accessible for people in the general public and why that was a thing that shifted narratives under our side. Secondly, then, on this whole idea of genres, and this was a major push that they had at first AF, right? They told us, oh, like you could get better, like you could fit these narratives into better like genres. We told you that wasn't mutually exclusive, right? Like we can have people in sci-fi coming out that we don't know, like that push shouldn't be weighed very, very highly. Finally, then, on buy-in. We told you then that it was far easier to opt in on our side because heteronormative media was more likely to propagate these narratives. We told you it was more impactful to have a well-known actor come out rather than just having a gay character representing gay issues. That palatability and the impact of like this whole like narrative was more important on our side. What did this mean? It meant that at the end of this debate, we got more buy-in, and we got better buy-in. We got more shifting of the Overton window historically, and that meant that we were championing queer rights. On the comparative, we think all of their all of that stuff wasn't sufficient on their side. We're very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I'd like to invite up the affirmative for their initial reply.
When every character that a queer child can identify with in pop culture has a storyline focused on coming out, you condition these children into the belief that they have to come out. That it's an integral part of their life experience, and that means that you pressure them into doing it before they're ready. You make them feel incomplete when they don't. In a society with such a horrific prevalence of homophobic and transphobic discrimination and violence, this can be the difference between a safe childhood and one where they're degraded, bullied, and potentially abused. Nothing that negating has presented can outweigh these harms. But how has negating tried to win this debate? Firstly, on catharsis and support for LGBTQ people, and then secondly, on more public buy-in to the LGBTQ media. I'll step out how they can't win on either of those clashes. Firstly, on catharsis and support. Let's take them at their best and credit them to a degree of catharsis and satisfaction from watching content focused on coming out. I think we mitigate these benefits because we tell you that they're not exclusive to their side. When we tell you like down the line in our framing that content about coming out still exists and that it's not just it's like not the focus and it's not what every single media focuses on. That means that like this media does still exist. People can still reap the benefits of it. What we tell you is that on our side, uniquely, when coming out is not the focus, we highlight other struggles that LGBTQ people go through. This is the vehicle for people feeling represented and supported when it's not just that one aspect of their identity that is focused on. They can still get that catharsis through those other explorations of discrimination, of internalized homophobia, those things that we make room for on our side of the house when the stories isn't broadly focused on coming out. But let's weigh this material on what we bring you. We gave you many reasons at Ollie for why LGBTQ plus people internalize that coming out is then core to their identity due to the limited amount of representation in this media. What this means is that when they don't come out, they feel invalidated. It creates this false idea of a rite of passage that these people have to go through. At the very basic core level, this is just really harmful in that you're telling people how they have to live their lives and you're shaming people when they don't live their lives in that way. But we tell you that on our side, it becomes a choice. People will, we don't agree with this idea that people don't come out when the media isn't focused on it. We think people can still do that for their own incentives, and we've told you about that down the line. What we tell you, though, is that when you have this focus, it leads to the coming out process being less thought out on these individuals because they see it as just something they have to do anyway. This means they come out to the wrong people. It means they suffer more bullying at school. It means they get more judgment in their friend groups, and they're treated poorly. Then, even if it is only a couple, or one or two extra children who do come out in an abusive household, who do have a bad risk calculus and come out in a situation where it's actually unsafe for them, we think that harm, even if it is only a few children, actually weighs much more highly than anything that they can bring you, because the tangible harms to those kids is that they could be physically hurt, is that they could suffer psychological trauma for the rest of their lives. These kinds of things stick with these children, and I think that even if this is only a marginal number of kids who do do that. They are so vulnerable. You should care about those actors the most in this debate. Then on this other point of clash around like public buy-in to LGBTQ plus media, the only thing they really brought us is that when you actively pertain to heteronormative frameworks, you like are more likely to get like buy-in from hetero people, right? I think that is fundamentally like problematic in that we tell you why these heteronormative frameworks are bad, and that on our side what you get is you get like LGBTQ plus people presented like without that association with coming out, and that means that people view that as a normalized process, that they don't associate it with the discrimination, that you don't reinforce that discrimination by every time you see an LGBTQ storyline, it's always alongside that discrimination. We tell you that like we're able to get like more variety of genres, that we're able to use other related things, which means we actually get the most buy-in from hetero people. We get the best understanding. We get the best investment in these stories.
I'd like to thank the speakers for an awesome debate. I'm going to go search up what the Overton window is after this, but before that, I would like to do
Yeah, that's what I was doing on my phone. Good job, guys.
Cheer out.
Wow. You baiting us, Rena?